Now, the Turkish president has announced a plan to extend his country's military operation against Kurdish forces in Syria. Turkish troops are currently fighting the YPG in Afrin and will now advance to Manbij, an area controlled by U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters.
The operation we've launched, named Olive Branch, to cleanse Afrin of terrorists, is successfully underway. Starting from Manbij, we will continue foiling the games which are being played along our borders, and we will cleanse our region completely of this trouble.
What we're hearing from the Turkish president is that he will now extend his military operation in northern Syria to include the town of Manbij, which is around 100 kilometers to the east of Afrin, which is where for the past few days the Turkish military has been battling it out with Syrian Kurds who are backed by the United States. Now, once the Turkish military moves into Manbij, this could potentially put the Turkish army in direct conflict with forces belonging to a major Turkish NATO ally, namely the United States. Washington is known to have some 2,000 special forces on the ground in Syria, and while none of them are thought to be in the Afrin area, they are deployed amongst various Kurdish enclaves that include the town of Manbij. Now, Manbij is controlled by US-backed Kurdish Syrian fighters. At the same time, we are hearing from the Turkish president that more than 250 Syrian Kurds, as well as Islamic State fighters, have been killed by the Turkish army and allied forces in the past few days. These figures are being disputed by the Kurdish side, who's also accusing Ankara of civilian casualties. This despite the fact that we are hearing from Turkey that they are trying to avoid civilian deaths as far as possible. Now, the American President Donald Trump has called for and is urging a de-escalation and a limit in the military operation that Ankara is conducting in northern Syria. All of this came to a head over the past few days after the United States announced that it was training and establishing a border security force that would comprise some 30,000 personnel, most of them Kurds, that would be deployed along the Turkey-Syrian-Iraqi border. And from what we're hearing on the ground, we do expect the military operation to grow, and no doubt the casualty count too will intensify.
Crowds have gathered in cities across Europe to voice their anger over Turkey's military offensive. In the German cities of Berlin and Cologne, crowds waved Kurdish flags. Demonstrators branded President Erdogan a terrorist and accused him of killing civilians in Afrin. Meanwhile, at least 200 people gathered outside the Dutch parliament in The Hague on Wednesday, calling on Turkey to end its military operation. A major pro-Kurdish rally has also taken place in the Syrian city of Kobane against the Turkish offensive. Crowds marched through the streets carrying the flag of Kurdistan. Demonstrators also voiced their concerns over the U.S. role in Syria.
The American stance in the region is unclear. Unfortunately, the US is using the Kurds to combat Islamic State. We fought ISIL in Syrian and Iraqi Kurdistan. It was the largest terrorist organization in the world, and we did that for the sake of global security. When we got rid of ISIL, the US started supporting those who are fighting the Kurdish people. So it's a shameful stance by the Americans.
For more on the Turkish role in Syria, we can now bring in Nicholas Davies, author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. Thanks for being with us here on RT International. So President Erdogan, a controversial figure in and of himself, but he plans to advance his Syrian offensive to Manbij. How much resistance is he going to encounter from Kurdish forces there, and how far could this escalate?
Well, this could escalate into a whole new phase of the war. These are experienced, well-trained, and well-equipped by the U.S. forces, the YPG. Yeah, this could get very, very ugly, and it could go on for a very long time. I think we have to hope there seems to be some kind of understanding between Russia, Syria, and Turkey. It seems that Erdogan has at least some kind of approval from Russia and the Syrian government to be doing what he's doing. And while Turkey certainly has a real desire to, to not have a Kurdish independent enclave on its borders there, there is a secondary objective, I think, here, which is to get the U.S. out of Syria. I imagine that the Syrian government, and perhaps the Russians too, are hoping that if the Kurds find that the U.S. is not willing to defend them, that they will then work something out with the Syrian government to have, internal autonomy, but maybe restore the borders to the Syrian government and the Syrian military, in effect restoring the sovereignty of a large part of Syria, while giving the Kurds an autonomous region, which they want.
Now, according to the UN, at least 24 civilians have been killed and 5,000 displaced in the Turkish offensive against the Kurds there in northern Syria. Do you think that there's any possibility that this operation could backfire on Turkey?
Well, yes, it could, because it's much easier to start a war than it is to end one. And if they get into prolonged combat with Kurdish forces over, Afrin and Manbij are just two enclaves, really, but there's a much larger area extending all the way east to the Iraqi border that is now controlled by the YPG, the whole enclave of Rojava. And if Turkey ends up fighting a war all the way across that whole area, this could get very, very ugly, and a lot more civilians could be killed by the Turkish airstrikes and Turkish artillery fire, and likewise on the other side of the border with the Kurds fighting back.
Now, Nicholas, it's interesting, the big elephant in the room, we have NATO allies against each other, so to speak. The U.S. president has warned Turkey against further escalation in Syria and any actions that could lead to a confrontation with the U.S. Do you think that President Erdogan is taking that warning seriously at all?
I don't know. I think, quite honestly, he probably at this point would take the views of the Russian and Syrian governments more seriously, because ultimately, there's not a whole lot that the U.S. can do. Yes, they have 2,000 special forces and other forces on the ground there, and they've been bombing Islamic State. It's been the heaviest bombing by the U.S. anywhere for a very long time, bombing Mosul and Raqqa and other areas. But the U.S. is not really in a position to militarily take on the Turkish army in northern Syria. So, what Secretary James Mattis has said is that the U.S. purpose, the U.S. reason for staying in Syria at this point, past the defeat of ISIS, is to prevent Syria regaining control of all its territory. He's been quite explicit about that, but that depends on the Kurds remaining allied to the U.S. and willing to maintain what was really a temporary expedient, even for the U.S. to use these Kurdish forces against Islamic State. And I think when the Kurds realize that the U.S. is not with them for the long haul, the Kurds hopefully can work something out with the Syrian government, which in turn will persuade Turkey to, to withdraw its forces and work out an accommodation between Turkey, Syria, the Kurds in Rojava, the YPG, and work out a peaceful solution to that whole situation in that part of Syria.
Well, one thing that we know is that the U.S. has never really been good at keeping their promises to the Kurds. A messy situation has gotten even messier. Nicholas Davies, author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. Certainly interesting to hear your thoughts.